'tis many's a gay night, from dark till daylight, I spend with people of high renown. But in all their grandeur and heaps to squander, my heart would wander for sweet Omagh town.
Good morning, midday, evening, middle of the night, day of the week. I'm not sure what it is, but calling Mr. Ford, are you in contact with us?
I am alive and well and taking your call.
Ah, good.
Here in the back of Beyond.
All right. And how is house arrest with you?
House arrest was grand. I've been out in the garden and taking advantage of the intermittent sun and putting down a couple of posts. So I was happy as Larry.
Right.
Out in the fresh air. Well, who are we going to talk about today?
Well, I think we'll talk about... Remember the one we done a couple of days ago or a week or two ago about your poems and the writing school, and then
Right.
Tommy Makem and Heaney? We lumped all together because I think we're all in this together anyway.
Right.
We deliberately left out, excuse me, W.F. Marshall. So I have an interview or a talk given by Bert Tosh, if you know him. Bert would be the religious correspondent of the
yes,
BBC,
yeah.
to the Kiley weekend some years ago.
Right.
I've unearthed that. We're going to play some of that. And that's a lecture he gave about Marshall and Marshall's life and stuff. A very interesting talk it is. Runs about 20 minutes or so. And then Tom was good enough to send me some poems of Marshall as well, to recite maybe 3 or 4 poems of him. And then you and I shall talk a bit about Marshall, and that will hopefully make up the nucleus of this little programme. Yeah,
that sounds good. I love Marshall's work. And not only because he was a local, as they would say here, but I think he captured something about Tyrone at a certain time. That Tyrone is a wee bit like the Quiet Man. It's a sort of almost like a never Ireland, and it was a never Tyrone. It was a place of the thatched cottage, and it was a place of bachelor farmers, and there was a kind of a romanticism to those poems.
Certainly was, and being a Presbyterian minister, you thought he'd been very conservative, but he actually wasn't. He had a great feel for folklore, hadn't he?
Yeah, I think a wee bit like Yeats. I know Yeats, as a young man, collected the fairy tales and the folklore in Sligo, where his grandparents lived, and around Drumcliff. And I think Marshall did the same. He had the same, I think, affiliation with the ordinary 5/8, but in particular he had a kind of a sympathy and an empathy with those bachelor farmers, those men living on their own, and in the wilds of Drumlister and places like that, and around Drumduff and Drumnakilly. And I think he appreciated the kind of the lyricism of the place names.
And his defence of the local dialect was a big thing.
Oh, completely, and a wee bit reminiscent of Robert Service, who would be almost, I suppose, a contemporary. Yes. That he had an ear for language, and I am fascinated by him as a poet and as a writer. And he was a man of he was of the Unionist tradition. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was a very staunch Unionist, and he was not afraid to put those beliefs down in poetry. And I admire anybody that has a conviction and is not afraid to put it out there for people to read or to listen to, whether you agree with it or not.
No, as I said, we all have our own opinions, I suppose, and we're all entitled to them.
Yeah.
But he certainly would have been a great man to sort of to support the look of Ireland in that way. And he produced a play, I think, one time, Shakespeare's version of Midsummer Night's Dream in a local dialect.
That's right. I saw it. I saw it actually up in Garvaghey in the GAA centre there, and it was very, very clever. Where he had he wrote the part of the mechanicals, the Midsummer Night's Dream, in Tyrone dialect. And I remember when I was at the Brothers, there was a good teacher called Brother McFarland, and he was firmly of the opinion that the dialect or the language in Tyrone was akin to Shakespeare's. He said Shakespeare would have talked about fleurs and doers and Windies. In fact, I remember studying for, it was GCSE or O-level or A-level or whatever, a play, and there was a line in the Shakespeare play about, tell your man to come here. And you look at the footnotes, and then the poor editor goes into great detail as to who your man is and what it means, whereas I think to us, your man is just something that we understand instinctively. It's like, do you remember the time we went to see The Weir in the Opera House with the late Dorothy Rowe?
Very well, yes. The
great writer, and they were just the Royal Court Theatre, and they were doing their version of this play set in Leitrim or whatever, but
yes.
And it was, a number of actors had their stories to tell, and basically it was storytelling by 4 or 5 characters, and the central figure was the barman. And I don't think the cast caught on to 2 very simple words, now. And now could have meant, what are you doing here? You're at college, now you're back as a barman, now. And I don't think they got their head around that now said so much. It could be tragedy, it could be resignation, it could be just a sense of disappointment. To them it was just now, 2 words, but to us, now says so much.
Doesn't it? He wrote a country sort of play as well, a comedy entitled The Corduroy Bag. Do you ever hear of that?
That's right. I know that was performed in 6 Mile Cross, and that's right. It was done a number of years ago, and I think Marshall's poetry, it needs to come to a kind of a younger audience or a young audience. A lot of the people of our generation would be well acquainted with the language and with the poems.
Yes.
But I think it's time that I think maybe a younger generation needs to be made aware of the way that he captured just the language of the people.
Yeah, in his book, maybe Ulster Sails West, he was very much informed about how the Ulster Scots shaped America as well.
Oh yeah, and Annie was very proud of that tradition. And when you think of the writers like there's a man called Roy Arbuckle, I think Tom Sweeney mentioned, he was in the same group as Tom, that he took the Ulster Scots tradition and kind of firmly shook it up, and has written songs, about the Ulster Scot tradition now. And I think he was kind of he's continuing what Marshall has done, and I also find very, very interesting the fact that you had 2 polar opposites within about 10 miles of each other. You had Alice Milligan, sometime in Mountfield, who was very, very nationalist, and you had Marshall, who was the other side of the coin, and I often wonder, did the 2 of them ever meet? And if they did, what did they say to each other?
That would make a nice play, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it? It would indeed. It would indeed,
Yeah, right.
I mean, I love it. But I'll tell you one of the poems of his I really like. It's called Keeley. And I'll give you maybe 2 verses of it.
Okay, good man.
And here it goes.
Okay.
Keeley by W.F. Marshall. It stopped my step on the hard flags, that verse of an Irish song. Patrolman, you on your Broadway beat, I'm feared you're thinking long. There's a low house, a thatched house, at the foot of Bantown Lane, with a half door and a hearth fire, and a pot linked on a crane. And then it ends with, and the door's barred, and the fire raked, and the socks hung on the crane, and the light dies in the low house at the foot of Bantown Lane. And if you read the poem, it is the same sentiment as W.B. Yeats, I will arise and go now and go to when it's free, or Oh Mary, this London's a wonderful sight, the song by Percy French. It's that tradition of meeting the man from your home place.
In a different place, in a different setting.
And just the whole sense of being away from home. And lovely wee poem, and it's a poem that you would rarely hear, so I hope the folks out there in the great blue yonder enjoy Bert Tosh's talk, and also Tom's renditions, and also are we having some Marshall himself?
We will put on some of Ulster Speaks. Remember from we collected that some years ago.
That's right. The talks he gave,
in the 30s, in the sort of mid-30s and before the war.
Yeah.
Well,
there'll be a revelation to people, because once they hear the voice, there's very little trace of a Tyrone accent.
No. Where was educating? Was it Galway University, was it? Did he do
He was, yes, he was in Dublin, and he then lectured in Magee. I think he taught elocution or English, and a lot of his poems, they capture Tyrone. And I know that you and I have our disagreement over this with Drumlister.
Yes, we do.
And we still have to get to the bottom of it. We talk about urban legends, but I think you come up with a rural legend, which must be a first, about how that me and me dad was written. And maybe if anybody out there has anything to add to that little debate, let us know.
We will indeed. Okay, Mr. Ford, thank you for your contribution. I shall...
Indeed, I look forward to Mr. Corrigan, and we shall meet again.
We shall.
Online or on air.
You shall go back to your landscaping now, I take it?
I shall indeed.
All right.
Goodbye.
Take care.
The Reverend W.F. Marshall was at times very disrespectful, and for that I salute him. Now, Bert, as I say, comes from the same ecclesiastical background, and he's going to talk for a while about this redoubtable Tyrone man on this most Tyrone of weekends. Bert's from Derry. There's absolutely nothing else wrong with him. And with that, I want to hand over to Bert Tosh and the Reverend W.F. Marshall. Thank you very much, Bert.
Thank you. I've been called many things in my time, never before an oxymoron. It's with a degree of trepidation that I come here today, being a mere Derry man, to speak about the Bard of Tyrone. Especially on a weekend when Tyrone as a county may well be on the cusp of sporting glory. And this explains why I will be disappearing rapidly. My colleague in the BBC, who normally produces Sunday Sequence, is a Fermanagh man, so what he's doing going to Croke Park tomorrow, I have no idea, but I am doing the decent thing. And I also acknowledge the risk that you took in inviting a Presbyterian minister, for we have a reputation, which may not be thoroughly undeserved, of being unable to stop when we've finished. Martina quoted from the poem, "I'm living in Drumlister and I'm getting very owl." The poem, which I think, and while it may be some exaggeration, I think it's the thing that more than anything else kept the name of W.F. Marshall alive for the 20 or so years after his death, until in 1983 Blackstaff Press brought out a collected edition of his works, and the sales of this astonished the publishers. William Forbes Marshall was born 115 years ago. His father was principal of 6 Mile Cross National School. His second forename, Forbes, as is not uncommon, was his mother's maiden name. After primary education in 6 Mile Cross, he went to the Royal School Dungannon, one of those schools founded in the early 17th century by James I and VI, who, according to Marshall, issued an edict, "My faithful servants shall endure this grief no more. I'll send the Holy Latin to Dungannon." With his brother Robert L., who later became a professor in Magee College in Derry, he studied at what was then the Queen's College in Galway, now University College, probably because, as there were very few students at the place, there was a good chance of getting a scholarship, something that's always appealed to a certain part of the Presbyterian mind. He graduated in arts, studied theology at the then Presbyterian Church in Belfast, and read at the same time for a Bachelor of Laws degree. He served as an assistant minister in a large Belfast congregation, was ordained to the Christian ministry in Ochnacloy in this county in 1913, remained there for 3 years, and then, somewhat unusually, was called to be minister of the congregation in which he'd been brought up, 6 Mile Cross. In 1929, probably for financial reasons, he was encouraged by his old college friend, the Reverend Robert Moore, to become minister of Castle Rock in County Derry. Moore had the unusual, some might even say dubious, distinction of, as well as being minister of Ringsend in County Derry for over 50 years, also serving for 14 of them as Minister of Agriculture in the Stormont government. In 1952, the Presbyterian Theological Faculty of Ireland awarded Marshall a degree of Doctor of Divinity, and he died 7 years later. He published a certain number of volumes of poetry. He published material on dialect studies. He broadcast widely and wrote a novel, Planted by a River, which was praised by the Ulster dramatist St. John Irvine. Marshall was a very confirmed unionist, although not uncritical of certain aspects of unionism. He admitted to having a certain respect for the men of 1798 who had risen up against tyranny. He was among the first to write about that earlier 18th century immigration, made up mainly of Presbyterians from the north of Ireland to America. His 1943 work, Ulster Sails West, catalogues the contribution of the Ulster Scot in the fight for independence and to the subsequent developments of the United States, a field that many writers of lesser quality have quarried since then. But for me, Marshall's booklet is somewhat spoiled by its polemical nature, for he was writing against a background of the neutrality of the then Irish Free State, and he was quite critical of Irish Americanism. He was firmly rooted in Tyrone. His love of place comes out in poem after poem. He seems almost to visualize God in his act of creation, making a special effort in this county. Aye, God was good, made level land, at Portydown and at Strabane, but knowing folk he thought black shame to make the country all the same, and so with heather, peat and stone he made the mountains of Tyrone. But in another poem, Dunmullen, the townland which is, I think, just over that hill, Marshall pictures God becoming rather fed up with the heather, peat and stone and settling for something altogether homelier. The Lord he made the Sperrin, the heather hills of Sperrin, the Lord he wrought in Sperrin till he tired of heath and stone. So then he came to Gortin, came up the road from Gortin and through the gap of Gortin to Dunmullen in Tyrone. It was then he made Dunmullen in a pleasant fold of ground. Oh, the hills he made them homely, and he set them all around. It was then he made a valley where the hazel blooms in May, and he filled it with the music of the burn beneath the brae. Mind you, he recognizes there's more to his love of the place than its appearance. I know that just a stranger sees no beauty there at all. I know it and forgive him, that his rapture is but small. For the song my heart is singing, strangers never heard it sung. And the secret of Dunmullen, you must find it when you're young. And another poem, Tyrone Jigs, which I confessedly quote at my peril, because some of you will say he didn't say that right, is one long evocation and celebration of this county's townland names. There's Cavan-Amara and Darkderry-Mean, there's Carrickatane and Moneydurdoe, with Strawletter Dallin and Cavan-Kilgreen, all dancing a jig with Creggan-Conroe. Oh, there's Curramacall and Bumacatall, and Mullashantullah and Brightgorty Crum, while merrily tripping up and down dipping are Sanachan-Row and Fernachan-Drum. Sanachan-Row and Fernachan-Drum, whereas alike from the boy to the plum, a fiddler could play it, a lilter could hum, Sanachan-Row and Fernachan-Drum. Now, that nearly wrecked the spell check on the computer when I put it in. I like that line Martina used earlier where she talked about carrying his homeland in his heart. And that's certainly what Marshall did. Nostalgia for this county is present in much of his verse, like one of his last poems, Tully Needle, written when Marshall was a minister of Castle Rock. There's splendour when the great seas roar along a northern strand and break and pound the patient shore, and fill the shining sand, but I was born in old Tyrone and love the quiet things that burn the chuckles round a stone, the song a blackbird sings. The little by roads free from dread, where one has time to wait and pat the horse that holds his head across a roadside gate. The summer hum of honey bees, or Sabbath peace unflawed, or green God's acre in the trees, or plain old house of God. It's very simple, perhaps deceptively so. But the pictures it paints, the burn chuckling, the horse looking over the gate, the plain meeting house in the planting, I actually find these quite moving. But it's not just countryside and landscape that Marshall turns attention to. Here's part of the Ferry Hill. There's a green hill near till a road. It's green with the shamrock that no man sowed, for the she showed the shamrock and brought the black bee to make it grow forever on the steep green lea. There's a burn slides by it to the railroad line, a slow burn by it this hill of mine, and man, it's so shapely and so green and so round, you'd know it was the wee folk that set it on the ground. And I know a good man and true, who had it from his neighbour, a good man too, that just half a year ago, coming from the mill, he saw the ferries dancing on this very hill. Now, Presbyterian ministers, whatever else they may be required to believe, are most emphatically not expected to believe in fairies. And when some years ago I made a radio programme about Marshall, I asked the late Dr. George Gillespie of Ballygolly if Marshall believed in the wee folk. No, he said judiciously, I wouldn't say he believed in fairies, but then I wouldn't say he didn't. And he pointed me to another of Marshall's poems, Bernice Glen, where this reference, if you were in grey moonlight up there, perhaps you might just change your mind like many men and look behind in Bernice Glen. But it's not, I suggest, for fairies or for singing the beauties of Tyrone that Marshall the poet is remembered. I suggest it's for a few poems in dialect, particularly Me and My Da, which has already been quoted, and Sarah Ann, the one that begins, I'll change me way of going, for my head is getting grey, I'm tormented washing dishes and making drops of tea. Marshall actually considered Drumlister to be a bit of trivia. He dashed off in a hurry for fun, and yet I can remember, and again Martina referred to this, I can remember going to concerts and other functions and going to ceilidh houses where the recital of that poem or Sarah Ann was considered one of the highlights of the evening, always received with reverence, laughter and applause, even though everybody knew the lines backwards and forwards. And even when the poems were out of print, they were passed along in dog-eared copies. There's humour, certainly. Humour in the description, like the kitchen, like a midden in the parlour, like a sty, there's half a foot of clabber in the street out by. And in the sequel to Sarah Ann are these lines, sure the bread that I baked was like concrete, and the butter now I would conceit the man that can eat his own butter, there's nothing that man couldn't eat. Part of the humour comes from the fact that Marshall was describing a character with whom many people would have been familiar, the bachelor farmer. I met one or two of them when I was a parish minister. And there was one character in the hills in the Derry Donegal border, and I was always feared to take tea with him. And if you'd known the house, you would have understood the fear. And I went in one day and he said to me, Mr. Tosh, he said, you never drink tea, but my nephew was on his honeymoon in Spain and he brought me back a bottle of wine. Would you take a glass of wine? So I thought, this is safe enough. And he brought me in the glass of wine and I sat looking at it. And there were two dead blue bottles floating on top. So I says I to myself, what do I do? If I put it in the fire, it might set the chimney on fire, or it might put the fire out. So I sat there, and Willie said to me, you're not drinking it, Mr. Tosh. And I said, oh, there seems to be a fly got in it, Willie. And Willie got up and walked out and returned with a spoon, fished out the blue bottles, and assured me I could drink it now. working on the principle that the alcohol would have had sufficient antiseptic qualities to undo any damage the blue bottles might do. I drank it and I'm still here. But there were plenty of men like that, mildly eccentric yet harmless, putting in their days looking after a few beasts, their evenings looking at the wall before the whole drear round began again. There was a pathos about them, and indeed about women living in such circumstances, unmarried because nobody might have wanted to marry them, or because of domestic circumstances like the attitude of the father in the Drumlister poem, who had an aversion to thin women. So while the descriptions like living in clabber to the knee may have humour, there's also sadness, reflecting purposelessness and frustration. The Dale man in this townland was cleaner reared nor me, but I'm dying in Drumlister, in clabber to the knee. Humour, pathos, the reflection of social mores that now seem strangely crude and unacceptable, where a girl could be bartered for the price of a mully cow, and where a woman's badly scarred face could be described as looking like a jail door with a bulge pulled out. Although I think that line was one Marshall borrowed. Or there's a description of Lisa Jane, who was a substitute for Sarah Ann. She's described as the fat one. She can plough. So that's how I got me big woman. We settled it quick, so we did. I'm content she's a brave civil crater and quiet and does what she's bid. Not hard to keep up, that's a good thing when times isn't good on the land. She's young, but she's settled, and more too, she can work in the bog like a man. Now, I don't think anyone would express those sentiments publicly nowadays, but I imagine they were not at all uncommon in the north of Ireland 60 or 70 or even fewer years ago, when small farms with poor land offered little more than subsistence. I tried to trace but couldn't, and it may have been said to me, the comment of a country farmer to whom sympathy was being expressed on the death of his wife, and his only response was, aye, she was a grand worker. Not that all Marshall's poems were universally accepted in Tyrone. A colleague of mine some years ago went to the 6 Mile Cross region to try to make a programme about Marshall, and the first house he went to, the man came out, and my colleague said he was here to make a programme about Marshall, whereupon a pitchfork was reached for, and my friend in no uncertain terms was told he would not be welcome back because of the reputation that had accrued to the neighbourhood because of the lines. And Sarah Ann's father, wee Robert, the descriptions Marshall offers of him could hardly be called flattering. He's presented as miserly and crabbit, nothing but a wart, a near begone old devil with a wee black heart, a crooked crabbit critter that be's neither well nor sick, yearning in the chimney corner or going happen on a stick. So you mind the girl for hiring that when shouting through the fair, I wandered in wee Roberts, I can summer anywhere. There's an echo of that line in Seamus Heaney's Servant Boy. He's wintering out at the back end of the year, swinging a hurricane through some outhouse. And the references are to the practice of hiring servants for a 6-month period at a rabble or a hiring fair. And Heaney knew some of Marshall's poems and has been known to recite them. Elsewhere, Marshall referred to Robert as a hirpling gazebo. It's a lovely phrase. Now, I am told that Robert was based, and fairly closely based, on one of the leading members of one of the Tyrone congregations where Marshall was minister. So was Marshall taking his revenge for what he described as the ups and downs of his time there? The other great appeal of these poems is, of course, that they're written in dialect, so you get words like midden and clabber and kelly and bizen and molly and greasy and foundered and hirpling, and pronunciations like cleaner reared for cleaner reared, and concerning for concerning. And I suspect that for people who at that time in the educational system were being actively discouraged from using dialect and dialect words, Marshall's use was a liberation and maybe an encouragement. For indeed, the study of the way we speak was one of his other great interests. He was, for his work in the field, made a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He compiled a dialect dictionary which never saw the light of day because the Red Setter pup got it the only manuscript. In 1935, he gave a series of 6 talks on the Northern Ireland service of the BBC, which were later published as Ulster Speaks, and I think they're of interest because of the current debate. For Marshall, Ulster speech was a rich tapestry made up of 3 components: Ulster Gaelic, Elizabethan English, Lowland Scots, the last 2 being introduced at the plantation. Any one of these components could be dominant, dependent on locality and settlement patterns. In fact, he thought there would be some point in saying that there are not even 3 but only 2, for Lowland Scots is Old Northern English. What you hear in Donaghadee and what you hear in Armagh are not so different as you might suppose. They have a common ancestor. Now, what he would have said about the current debate on whether Ulster Scots is a language or not, I will not even start to speculate. Marshall was scathing about those people who tried to improve their way of speaking. To be sure, he wrote, you meet now and again some Ulster people trying to speak a language they were not brought up in and using an accent they think is Southern English. It is a dangerous experiment. As an aside, I might mention my father's comment about such people. He remarked that the buttermilk would always come through the brochan. And he quoted the example of a friend of his who, in an attempt to speak proper, was once heard to remark, "There's no tea in this teapot." Never mind the fact that Alexander Pope would have said tea. So Marshall mounts a robust defence of the dialect. Fair play, that's all I ask for our rustic speech. When a Fintan man says he be to be away somewhere, don't forget he's only saying something that Shakespeare said before him. When a Limavady man tells you he heard a fella speaking in the wireless, please remember that the famous Dr. Johnson said that heard was the right way to say heard, that an 18th century poet like Pope believed that fella was the right way to say fellow, and neither of the two of them would have dreamt of pronouncing the final G in a word like speaking. Both of them would have said spaken. So there you are. You might toss your head at the Limavady man, but Dr. Johnson wouldn't have rebuked him. He would have rebuked you. Marshall gives many examples from a wide and deep literary knowledge to illustrate that dialect words have a respectable pedigree. Take the word lock. This is of interest to me because about a year ago I said to one of my work colleagues, "Could you hand me a lock of paper, please?" Only to be met by a look of incomprehension. And when the request was repeated, she assured me that she hadn't a clue what I was talking about, so I asked for a wheen of sheets instead, with not dissimilar results. You just cannot get the staff these days. Here's Marshall on the word lock. Take a farmer's directions to his servant man, give that horse a lock of hay. That word lock, meaning a moderate quantity, is in the English dialects. But a well-known traveller and writer, Fynes Morrison, in his description of Ireland in the 17th century, says about the Irish cattle that they have to stand or lie all night in a dirty yard without so much as a lock of hay. In Henry IV, Part 1, you read about a power of English, which is exactly the same phrase we use when we say there was a power of cattle at a fair. And you won't get very far in the stately authorised version until you come across ample justification for our fashion of saying, "For to, he hired me for to lift corn." Jesus went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day for to preach. To be fair, Marshall is probably much stronger in English influences on the speech of Ulster than on the Scots or Gaelic ones, and he acknowledged with regret that he had little knowledge of the Irish. Well, that's W.F. Marshall, a bare and barely adequate record of fact. In retrospect, Marshall could hardly be called a great poet. Much of his verse is pedestrian, forgotten, and not undeservedly so. His work on dialect has been to some extent superseded. His other writings are little known, and while he was a faithful minister of the gospel, he would hardly be regarded as a major ecclesiastical figure, for he ministered in 3 small and, in the eyes of ambitious churchmen, obscure congregations. And yet Alec Blair, a well-known County Antrim local historian, credits Marshall with, and I quote, virtually single-handedly creating a culture and heritage for the Ulsterman of which he could be proud. He gave him a distinctive consciousness which enabled him to have an identity of his own. I suspect the claim's overblown, overstated. And yet I feel that Marshall deserves to be remembered and celebrated as more than just the writer of 2 or 3 well-known and well-loved dialect poems. My own feeling is that Marshall's significance lies in the fact he was steeped in the word and yet moved beyond it without ever betraying it. Dr. John Dunlop, a former Presbyterian moderator, wrote, "The Word of God is central to Presbyterian thinking. Presbyterian suspicion of art may go back to the post-Reformation suspicion of symbolism, which tended to encourage the use of imagination. When the imagination is let loose, the mind may no longer be controlled by the word. This culture has not produced many poets, authors, or artists." And yet another Presbyterian poet, despite Dunlop's comments, there have been a few, W.R. Rogers writes, "The dry riposte, the bitter repartees, the Northman's bite and portion, his deep sup is silence. Though still within his shell, he holds the old sea roar and surge of rhetoric and holy writ." Marshall was in many ways a traditional Irish Presbyterian, although that breed is so multifarious as to speak of any one of them being typical is to run the risk of generalization. He ministered at a time when the sermon was something to be carefully prepared, well delivered, savoured and reflected on, at a time when there was in Presbyterian society more than a suspicion of the visual and the emotional, when music of any type apart from the metrical psalms was not universally appreciated, and yet Marshall, I would argue, moved beyond Rogers' deep sup of silence. He loved language and its use. He was full of conversation. He could be quite racy, at least in private. He did not lack imagination nor resist its use. And to a people respectful of the word and yet at the same time suspicious of overblown language with its risk of insincerity, Marshall was in his element and was able to push boundaries back. In doing so, he belied the caricature, and I'm sure it is a caricature, although like all caricatures not wholly undeserved, of the Northern Presbyterian as dreary and dull and dour and essentially humourless. Marshall, I think, married the word, which can be dry and precise and deadening. He married the word to a rich humanity and a rich humour. In one of his poems, Marshall describes the very Reverend Dr. William McCain, with whom he had worked in Belfast. So the great spaces of his mind were sorted with gear of wisdom garnered far and wide, till truth to fairer heights of beauty soared, and God was glorified. I think it would stand too as a fitting epitaph for W.F. Marshall.
Sarah Ann. I'll change me way of going, for me hair is getting grey. I'm tormented washing dishes and making drops of tea. The kitchen's like a midden, and the parlour's like a sty, and there's half a foot of clabber on the street out by. I'll go down again the morrow on me keeley to the cross, for I'll have to get a woman, or the place will go to loss. I've fothered all the cattle, and there's nothing after that but clocking round the ashes wi' an old tomcat. Me very ears is buzzing from the time I light the lamp, and the place is like a graveyard, bar the mare would give her stamp. So often I be thinking and contriving for a plan of how to make the match again wi' Robert's Sarah Ann. I used to make wee Roberts of a Sunday after prayers. Sarah Ann would fetch the teapot to the parlour up the stairs, and once a week for sartin I'd be chapping up the door, and there wasn't one would open it but her, ye may be sure. And then, for all was going well, I got a neighbour man and took him down to spake for me an axe for Sarah Ann. Did ye ever know wee Robert? Well, he's nothing but a wart, a near begone old devil wi' a wee black heart, a crooked, crabbed crater that be's neither well nor sick, girning in the chimney corner or going happen on a stick. So you mind the girl for hiring that went shouting through the fair, I wanted an wee Roberts, I can summer anywhere. But all the same, wee Robert has a shop and farm alone. You'd think he'd do it decent when it come to Sarah Ann. She bid me axe 100, and we worked him up and down. The deal I hate he'd give her, but a cow and £20. I pushed for 20 more for buy to help to build a byre, but ye might as well be talking to the stone behind the fire. So I says till John, me neighbour, she were only lost in time. Just let him keep his Miley, I can do without her prime. Just let him keep his daughter, the hungry-looking nurr. There's just as chancy women on the countryside as her. Man, he let the big Trevally, and he sent us both, you know. But Sarah busted crying, for she seen we mayn't go. Aye, she fell till the crying, for you know she isn't young. She's nearly past her market, but she's civil with the tongue. Now that's half a year or thereaways, and here I'm sitting yet. I'll change me way of going, aye, I'll do it when I'm fit. She's a snug, well-doing woman, no better in Tyrone. I'll go down again the morrow, for I'm far too long me lone. Well, the night, the wind is rising, and it's coming on to sleet. It's spitting down the chimney on the grease at me feet. It's whistling at the windy, and it's roaring round the barn. There'll be piles of snow the morrow on more than Mulliharn. But I'm for tackling Sarah Ann, no matter if the snow is everywhere shiboing. When the morrow comes, I'll go. The Drumnachilly Devil. I met a girl in Berra, and she said her name was Sarah, and I thought she was as fair a lass as ever wore a shoe. So I went and sat beside her, and with tea and buns supplied her, and to soften her I tried her wi' a lozenge or two. Then later I got bolder, and I nipped her on the shoulder. Oh, I nipped her, and I told her I would take her on me knee. But she said, you'll be in bother, for I'll go and tell me mother. I'll go home and tell me mother if you're impudent to me. But she said it wi' a twinkle, and a brow without a wrinkle, and her laugh was like a tinkle that invited laughing back. So I started to provoke her, and to hug her, and to poke her, till she vowed that I would choke her, and her stays began to crack. Says I now, don't be silly, I've a farm in Drumnachilly, and the more it may be hilly, there's a handy bit of bog. We'll be happy there together, wi' a bullock in the heather, and a goat upon the tether, and a donkey and a dog. Then it wasn't long we tarried, till the two of us was married, and home the donkey carried us, the presents made a load, and on them Sarah sittin' wi' a clocker and a kitten, as we jingled like a flittin' up the Drumnachilly road. But the night was getting chilly when we come to Drumnachilly. I could hear the bleats of Lily as the graith came off the ass. Says I, I'll get a bucket, for I don't know how she struck it. So I lifted one and took it up to Lily in the grass. Well, the goat was very willing, and the bucket bravely filling, but the milk was nearly spilling when I heard an awful squeal. And then there come a clatter over stones and lying water. It was Sarah on the batter up the loman to the field. She was lepping like a lion, and her petticoats was flying. She was roaring, she was crying, fit to waken up the dead. Oh, she come without delaying, and between the gowls and praying, I made out what she was saying, John, the devil's in the bed. I ran in to see the devil, with a mind to speak him civil, and behold ye, Sarah's devil was a hairy old buck goat, with a smell for human noses that was anything but roses, and a beard on him like Moses, and a dicky at his throat. Says I, me neighbour Mickey must have done it for his tricky, but a goat that wears a dicky is a goat I can't abide. And because a man that smelled him would incline to do it seldom, I cut the ropes that held him, and I chased the buck outside. Oh, sometimes me and Sarah dresses up and goes to Berra, but she'll never let me wear a decent dicky like the rest. And the thing that is uncivil is to mention Sarah's devil, the drum na killie devil, with the dicky on his chest. The Runaway. I tell yous afore about marrying, how the notion come into me head. I was living in dirt and I'm desperate. I was poisoned with tea and white bread. I was puddling at shirts and a bucket. I was baffled with servants and foul. And one night, wi' me feet and the ashes, I rusted, I did be me soul. Sarah Ann, sure yous heard about her too, but yous didn't hear more nor the half. She's a fessend old thing, but her father, wee Robert, is terrible well off. But boys, when I mentioned the fortune, you'd have thought, when the argument riz, that he hadn't the nails for to scratch with. He's as mean as get out, so he is. Well, he cooled in the skin he got hot in. He got leave, the crooked old colt. No fault till his daughter, I left her. But I found myself still on a holt. Sure, the bread that I baked was like concrete, and the butter, now I would conceit. The man that can eat his own butter, there's nothing that man couldn't eat. I'd a litter of pigs to sit up wi', and pigs is like Christians, man dear, you'd have thought they were striving to tell me, we're lost for a woman up here. Calves died on me too in the springtime. The cattle got foundered in rain. Hens clucked or they took the disorder. And me heart warmed till Sarah again. So I went, and if Robert was hisky, Sarah Ann was as nice as could be. She done well, for who would she get now, Dale Awan, if she didn't get me? But her father had still like a coolness, not one word of welcome he dropped, nor he never said what he would give her. He was doting, she said, he was apt. I got full on the June fair of Carman. I rid home and I met Sarah Ann. The turf was near ready for clamping, and a woman can lend a good hand. Says I, will ye come for a huffin'? Ye'll not. Well, listen to this. Yon hirpling gazebo your father, he'll neither say aye, no, nor yes. So says I, I'll not stand it no longer. Ye can take me or leave me, and mine, here's the colt, can take me in the saddle, with you and the bardocks behind. So come on now, or stand there forever. Come on now, quit scratching your chin. It's a runaway, that's what will make it, till Thompson's up there in Clough-Finn. Sure I knowed she would come, sure I knowed it. Is it her? Boys, she just made a bolt, got a shawl and whisked it about her, got straight legs behind on the colt. Aye, straight legs, for that's the way women be's riding the horses all now. But heth, 'twas an odd-looking runaway, for the colt had to walk like a cow. Old Thompson was glad for to see us, and decent, he done what was right. He sent for the drink and the neighbours. We had dancing and tea the whole night. We got drunk, and we all fell to fighting, but me sang old John's purty tough. It was prime how he leathered all round him, and him just as full as a shock. Big Jim catched a hout of me whiskers. Says I, "Ye can try yourself, Jim." But me bowl stare on with a potstick, so left her trademark on him. "He unsignified ghost," says his mother, and with that, just before he could wink, she catched Sarah on with a thrapple and whammelled her right on the sink. When women gets wicked, they're Tara. Ye'll not interfere if you're wise, for 10 town lands wouldn't settle the burl that 2 women can raise. It was nearly been that up in Thompson's. We fought from the fire till the door. We fought, if you'd say it was fighting, we fought in a heap on the floor. That and all, we got great afore morning. We were friends to other, ye see. John yucked just after our breakfast, and we started for Roberts us 3. But we never thought what we were in for. Heth no, we driv up at a trot. But the welcome was sharp, 'twas a pitchfork, and that's all the welcome we got. Boys, ye never seen such an a handling. I was thunderstruck watching the burl, the old da lumping out with a pitchfork, and the friends making glam for the girl. She dragged her out over the tailboard, she screamed, but I daren't interfere, and they sliped her, oh lummity father, they sliped her right onto the stair. The gowls of wee Robert was Tara. The veins rizzled like cords on his skull. "How dare ye? How dare ye? How dare ye? I'll take ye to court, so I will. Ye must call me for all the old turf men, all ever ye heard he went through." Says I, "Ye may go till the bad place, I'm as good just as she is or you." And says I, "My old boy, you're as ignorant as a pig let loose on a fair." Old Thompson broke in, and he told him he couldn't fetch guts till a bear. Well, boys, he was frothing with anger. The spittles flew from him apart. But what good was that? We were done for. We just had to leave him and march. I come home. I sat down in the kitchen. Thinks I, I'll go through with it now. So I riz and went back to old Thompson's. He was putting a ring on a sow. And says I, "I've a 5-naggin bottle, put on your coat, John, it's like rain. Us 2'll go up to Long Francis and tell him I'll take Liza Jane." Says he, "You've no call to be hasty." Says I, "Oh yes, I have call. When the buzz gets out through the country, I'll not get a woman at all." Says he, "Liza Jane, who would she be?" "The fat one," says I. "She can plough." "Be me soul," says John, "that's a Tara. But no matter, I'll go with ye now." So that's how I got me big woman. We settled it quick, so we did. I'm content. She's a brave civil creature, and quiet, and does what she's bid. Not hard to keep up. That's a good thing when times isn't good on the land. She's young, but she's settled, and more too. She can work in the bog like a man. She has no backspines in her other, no harm in her more than a hen. If I take maybe 1 or 2 halfins, she never gets up on her own. Sarah Ann now can handle a potstick, if that's any offset, I mean. Taking one thing just with the other, I'm thankful I picked Liza Jane. Me and me da. I'm living in Drumluster, and I'm getting very old. I have to wear an Indian bag to save me from the cowl. The deal a man in this town lawn was cleaner than me, but I'm living in Drumluster and clabber to the knee. Me da lived up in Carman and kept a servant boy. His second wife was very sharp, he buried her with joy. Now she was thin, her name was Flynn, she come from Cullentra, and if me shirt's a clatty shirt, the man to blames me da. Concerning women, sure it was a constant word of his, keep far away from them that's thin, their tempers easy riz. Well, I knowed too, I thought would do, but still I had me fears, so I kiffled back and forward between the two for years. Wee Margaret had no fortune, but 2 rosy cheeks would please. The fair Milan's was Bridget's, but she took the pock disease. And Margaret, she was very wee, and Bridget, she was stout, but her face was like a jail door with the bolts pulled out. I'll tell no lie, and Margaret, she thought the world of me. I'll tell the truth, me heart would leap the sight of her to see. But I was slow, ye surely know the reason of it now. If I left her home from Carman, me da would raise a row. So I swithered back and for it till Margaret got a man. A fella come from Mullislan and left me just the one. I mind the day she went away, I had 1 stroke an hour, and cursed the wasp from Cullentra that made me da so sour. But crying cures no trouble. To Bridget I went back, and faced her for it that night week beside her own turf stack. Axed her there, and spoke her fair, the handy wife she'd make me. I talked about the land that joined. Begob, she wouldn't take me. So I'm living in Drumlister, and I'm getting very old. I creep to Carman once a month to try and make me soul. The deil a man in this townland was cleaner rare nor me, and I'm dying in Drumlister and clabber to the knee.
There are certain laws which writers of English are expected to obey. Most of you know something about them, for you were taught them at school. But these laws aren't made by the people who teach them. They're not even made by the people who write the grammars. They're laws of usage. Of what usage? The usage of our best writers. So as far as written English is concerned, these laws give us a standard that we can apply. But things aren't quite so easy in the case of spoken English. Here again we've got a standard, the usage of our best speakers. But who are our best speakers? All people of education and culture don't speak English in exactly the same way. For example, most of us can distinguish by his way of speaking an educated Scotsman from an Englishman of the same class. But which is the better speaker? Some people claim that the best spoken English can be heard in Dublin. Dr. St. John Irvine has championed Ulster and Belfast. Professor Wilde has said that standard English is the English in vogue at the court, the older universities, and the great public schools. He may be right for England. Even so, what's the sense in a standard that's disregarded by probably 9/10 of the great English-speaking world? My notion is that all this talk about best speakers gets you nowhere. Let's just say good speakers and leave it at that. For surely it's only the most pedantic person who would deny that there's good English to be heard in England, north and south, in Edinburgh, in Dublin, and in Belfast, and for that matter in Sydney, Cape Town, or Toronto. There's a difference, of course, in the way cultured people speak in all these places. And why shouldn't there be a difference? Good speaking is an art, and like all good art, it ought to be individual. Look at it this way. Sir Winston Churchill is an Englishman. Ramsay MacDonald was a Scotsman. St. John Irvine is an Ulsterman. Nobody with an ear for such things could mistake the nationality of any one of these three. But they all spoke good English, and to contend that they didn't do so would be waste of breath. Well then, let's agree that good speakers differ in their way of speaking. Why do they differ? Why is it that all good speakers of English don't speak it in the same way? Well, as a matter of fact, There are two answers to that question. The first is that uniformity is impossible. It just can't be got. You see, English isn't a dead language like Latin. It's alive, and everything with life in it has got to reckon with change. You can't point to a single period in history when all the English people spoke English in the same way. It's not merely at the present time that we can see how good speakers differ. Long ago, these differences were observed, and they said that Sir Walter Raleigh had only to open his mouth and you'd know he was from Devonshire. His Devonshire dialect didn't prevent his advancement at court. And remember, Sir Walter was more than a court favourite. He was a great writer. You know, a language is in a way just like a human being. When it gets no exercise, it gets dancy. If you tie it down, it can only do one of two things, burst its bonds or die. It's got to get on or get out. So English kept going on. It even defied control. If it saw that a word was useful, it borrowed it. If it took a spite at a word, it threw it away. In short, you couldn't prophesy what it would do, but you would be sure that it would keep moving. And that movement is just what gives it charm. We're not sickened by its staleness, and when it loses its variety, we'll know that it's dead. So we can be quite definite here. Uniformity isn't possible, and even if it were possible, it's not desirable. That's the first answer. But there's another. All over England and Scotland and Ireland, there are local ways of speaking English. You can call them rustic ways if you like, because they thrive only in the country. When they come into the cities, they nearly always die. England still has a lot of these local forms of spoken English. So has Scotland, and so has Ulster. Well, I need hardly tell you that these dialects are different from the English of today. Their idioms are different. Their grammar is different. They have words that are never used now in polite speaking. They have vowel sounds and consonant sounds of their own, and their pronunciations would horrify a governess. In all these ways they differ from modern English, and in the same ways, more or less, they differ from each other. Now, whether you like it or not, all of you have got something from these dialects. What else would you expect? They've been in the country so long, and they affect both town and country people. A city like Belfast is full of people who have come in from the country and brought with them their country speech. It's true, of course, that a city will kill this speech in a generation and will replace it in many instances with something less worthy. But the fact remains that dialect is always floating about a city, and it has its effect even on those who are city bred. For example, the average Belfast man, or indeed the average six-county man, will tell the world when he opens his mouth that he comes from Ulster. He may snort at dialect, but he'll use the vowel sounds of his native province. He'll say no and die and there and really and cook and judge and should and could, and he'll not speak a single one of these words like a southern Englishman. To be sure, there are some Ulster fatheads who speak a strange dialect of their own invention, imagining it to be southern English. But sensible people will be grateful to these fatheads, for it is by them that the gaiety of Ulster life is sometimes much enlarged. Let me make myself quite clear. Behind accent is dialect, but nobody can object reasonably to any accent in its own place. If I say that the right place for an Ulster accent is on the lips of Ulster people, I am throwing no stones at a minority whose English contacts, social and educational, make their accent becoming. So much then for the influence of dialect on good speakers. But what about dialect itself? What's the good of it nowadays? The only use that some people have for it is that it's a test of social position. And quite a lot of people get into a bad temper about it and write letters to the papers. Yet for all that, there's no room for two opinions here. The dialects are of great value. Supposing you want to study life as it was lived in the past, what do? You read books about it. But you can do more than that. You can go to a museum and see bits of the past. Now that's what a student of English does when he goes to the dialects. The dialect country is his museum, the place where he can still hear for himself the English of long ago. Is it little wonder then that the Times Literary Supplement should say that no one knows English who doesn't know the dialects? Ulster itself has many dialects. There's nothing strange about that, for England has the same story to tell. And as a matter of fact, it's England that's to blame, if there is any blame, for our having dialects here. You say, what about the Scots speech in Ulster? Well, Lowland Scots is just Old Northern English. You say, what about the Irish element in Ulster speech? Well, we'll come to that later, a charming and important element. But leaving it out for the moment, the rest is Lowland Scots and a mixture of dialects from places like Devon and Kent and Warwickshire and the Welsh border. That's why we're in the family of English dialects. That's why we can read a Warwickshire word book and find the bulk of the words in it homely and familiar. That's why we don't need a glossary when we come across words in Shakespeare like team and frush and limber, and when we find him writing of people who think long. Now and then we see in the press a reference to Ulsterisms. There are no Ulsterisms except the Gaelic ones. You'll get all the others somewhere in the dialects across the water, and you'll get whole hosts of them in the good English writers of the past. They're here just because they were brought here. We just kept what we got. Do you think it was worth keeping? Some of our people don't think it was. Not long ago, a voice was lifted up loudly against the broadcasting of dialect from Belfast. Had we no regard for the tourist traffic? Visitors, it was said, wouldn't come to a country where the people spoke in such a barbarous way. Now, tourists are precious, and I'm all for handling them gently. But if dialect scares these tourists to death, how do they manage to stay alive in England and Scotland? And then, not long ago, Dr. St. John Irvine advised his readers to go to Ulster if they wished to hear English spoken as it was in Shakespeare's time. One reader spurned his advice with great scorn. He said the Ulster speech was rough and uncultivated and wasn't like Shakespeare's English at all. The right place to hear Shakespeare's English was among the peasants of Warwickshire. Now, whatever this critic knew about the speech of Warwickshire, he knew nothing at all about the speech of Ulster. For I've got a Warwickshire word book that runs to nearly 300 pages, and believe me, I could steal far more than half of it and turn it out as a book of Ulster words and Ulster pronunciations. Has it ever struck you about these criticisms how one word always seems to be cropping up? It's the word barbarous. Now, I'll not fight with you over this word at all if you'll give it its original meaning of different, for our rustic speech is different. But I want to impress on you once more that we didn't invent it. It's just a survival of the good English of the past. Do you know that scholars all over Europe are working at the English dialects, in Sweden, in Denmark, and in Germany, as well as in England and Scotland? Do you think that these men of European reputation are wasting their time over something that's of no account? No, you can't think that. Here in Ulster are great speech museums, the farmhouse, the labourer's cottage, the village street, and the country road. The scholars know the value of these museums, and ours is one of the very best. Dialects weren't knocked about here and disturbed and corrupted the way they were in England. What we got, we kept. I've tried to show you that in this at least we've nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, the boot is on the other foot, and every student of historical English will say to us, thank you.
'Tis many's a gay night from dark till daylight I spend with people of high renown. But in all their grandeur and heaps to squander, my heart would wander for sweet Omagh town.